Hello people, today I'm going to be teaching you how to make a text-based adventure slash story game with Python as a way to teach coding. This is for people with absolutely no experience and just want to learn with a slightly more fun way than just, learning by the book. So we're going to be doing this with Python because I think it's pretty easy for anyone to learn. I think it's the easiest programming language to pick up. It's the easiest to look at least. And if you want to see what version I'm using, it's up here 3.10.8. You can just go to python.org, I think, or whatever the website is, and download it there. And after it finishes downloading, you should see, if you search on your computer, you should see something called idle. If you look for it, look it up, and if you click it, it should open up something that looks like this. Don't worry about necessarily what it is, just know that this is what we call our interface where we're going to write our code, or where we can execute code, so to speak. And you're going to want to go up to File, New File, and it'll open up this brand new window, and if you want, you can just slide it off to one side. And this is going to be where we write our code. So in general practice, it's usually good practice for everyone's first program to print to the screen "Hello World." It's just tradition amongst programmers for this to be people's first program. So if you want to do that, go ahead and type this out. If you want to be edgy and type something else, you go ahead. I won't stop you. So in your second window that opened up, type out the word print. We'll go over what this means in a second. And then inside the parentheses that are next to print, open and close parentheses right after print. Inside those parentheses, open and close quotation marks. And inside those quotation marks, type hello space world exclamation mark if you want. And hit file and save this file. You can call it whatever you want. I'll just put it in my desktop and call it test program. There you go. And now if you hit run module, hit OK, and there you go. Your code runs. In the first window it should execute. Prints hello world to the screen. That's your first program. Ta-da. Okay, so now let's go over what we just did. So we typed print, we open and close these parentheses, and inside that we typed something in quotes, 2 words, and a bunch of characters, like with the exclamation mark, for example. So this print is highlighted in purple. This is what we call a function, so to speak, in Python. And a function just means when we type out this word and we put these parentheses after it, we want our code to do something. So for Python, every Python program comes with print as a function, and it just means that when we type print, anything that we put in the parentheses within quotation marks will just get printed to the computer. That's what print does. So we can type whatever we want with the inside. So if I type print 10 plus 10 equals 20, just anything. It could be numbers, letters, anything. And if I run that, it then prints hello world, right, our first line, and then it prints right after the next thing, 10 plus 10 equals 20. So that's the first thing that you want to get used to, printing statements to the console. And once you get the hang of that, and just understanding what that means to just run that and print, you can do that at any moment in time. Let's go over something very important in coding, and it's called variables. So let's say I wanted to print something to the console, I don't know, a bunch of times. Say I wanted to say hello world a bunch of times, right? So print hello world, let's say like 3 times. Print hello world print. This is pretty annoying already, see? Right, print hello world, print hello world, print hello world. Print hello world 3 times. Now, we're reusing this word a lot, hello world, or this whole thing in here. So, to allow us to take advantage of the fact that we're repeating that so many times, let's create a variable. So a variable is just a placeholder for a value that we're going to store within that placeholder. So not in layman's terms, let's write out the line x equals hello world in quotation marks. So what we just said is we're telling the computer the letter X, whenever we type the letter X anywhere in this page here, we are actually referring to the in quotation marks phrase hello world anytime we type X. So what that means is anytime we have the phrase hello world in quotation marks, what we really can just abbreviate it to is just X. So in here in this print statement, we don't need to type hello world in quotation marks because the computer knows right now that X essentially means the same thing. Both this and this will output the same thing, but notice that this is significantly shorter because it knows that X, it will turn X when it runs into open quotes hello world close quotes. So now if we wanted to do what we originally wanted to do, which was print it 3 times, notice how much nicer this is to do. When we run, same output. Hello world, hello world, hello world. Simple. So with that in mind, with variables, they're very powerful, but it's important to know some theory on them and know that there's many different things you can store in a variable. So with that being said, let me now introduce the concept of data types. So we just stored this data, these 2 words, it's technically a data, into the letter X for the computer to know, so that we can know as well when we write that X means this data. So this data in programming, words, you can tell by the quotation marks, we call them strings. Strings are denoted by these quotation marks, and essentially it's essentially just words, characters, like a list of characters, right? In a group, or not in a group, and a bunch of words, I guess. So that's one data type. There's really only 4 you should be mindful of as someone starting out programming. This is one of them, string. It's a very important one, very powerful one as well. The other one is a lot simpler to wrap your head around. It's integers, right? You've been learning about integers since kindergarten. For example, that, right? If I print X now, it'll just print the number. Oh, I misspelled it, my bad. Print. Yeah, 10, right? Because now the computer knows X is 10. So this is what we call an integer, right? It's a rational number that does not have a decimal point, right? It's just it's a whole number. That's what an integer is. So the other type of value that you should know is what is called a double, which is, not an integer. It's a number with a decimal point. So for example, 10.01. So now if I run this program, it'll print that number. This is called a double. So far we have 3. We have doubles, numbers with decimals, integers, whole numbers, and strings. So notice, if I do this with the quotation marks, making this a string, if I run this code, it looks the same as the original one, but this one was an integer. This one is a string. There is a difference, a very important difference. We'll get into it later, but for now, just recognize that this one is an integer, this one is a string. There is a difference, even though they look identical in the output. So, the last type is a Boolean. A Boolean may sound like a fancy term, but it really just means it's a value that can be either true or false. So in Python, I believe it's capital T and capital F. You say true or false. And if I run this code, it will print the word false. But essentially, notice how it turns orange. A Boolean is what we use in programming to evaluate, like, it's how we check conditions, essentially, right? If something is true, do this. If something is false, do something else. We'll get into that in a moment as well. But these are the 4 data types that you want to really get comfortable with. Strings, integers, doubles, booleans, right? Strings are words or characters. Integers are whole numbers. Doubles are decimal numbers, right? And booleans are true or false statements. So knowing this, you can create essentially any of those as variables. So I want you to also be aware that a variable name can be whatever you want. It is entirely up to you. I use X here. You can use Y, Z, A. You can say name. You can say variable, var. Like, anything can be a variable name, right? But ideally, you want to make it something that makes sense to anyone who reads your code, or more importantly, you, right? Because I could write my code like this, but this would be an absolute nightmare to try to understand, like, what does this actually mean to me as a human being, right? Because the computer can tell this, oh, whenever you say this string of characters, he's talking about hello world. But what is this supposed to tell me, right? It doesn't tell me anything. So just try to keep a general naming convention when you write your code, right? Something that just makes sense, like phrase here, for example, right? That makes sense. It's the same thing, but it makes more sense to anyone who reads your code and yourself when you're writing your code, and it'll save you a lot of trouble in the long run. So just try to both not do, ugly names like those list of characters, and also try not to just do overly simple things like just a letter, for example. Or if you're going to do a letter, make it a letter that makes sense in the context of whatever it is you're writing in code. So mess around with all this stuff and get very comfortable with those 4 data types of variables. And once you get comfortable with that, I'm going to introduce a new function to you. And remember, functions are just code you can call on from Python. So for example, the print function, right? And you can tell it's a function by these 2 parentheses here. And it needs something inputted into the function, right? Like a string or an integer or a double, right? And the point of the print function is it outputs something to the console. That is the sole purpose of the print function. That is its job. Whatever you put in the parentheses, it will output into the console. So now I'm gonna introduce you to another function, right? You'll be able to tell because of the parentheses, and it's purple. Input. So see, it's already purple. Input, once again, also has parentheses. Input, like print, whatever you type into these parentheses will output to the console, just like print. This is the same exact thing. So if I type the phrase hello world, right? If I run, it will print hello world to the console, just like print. But there is a difference. Input, almost like a variable, after it's run, it will print to the console, and then it will stop the code at this line with input, and it'll actually ask the user, not directly, but it will allow the user to type into the console anything. So I'll show you this as an example. If I run this, it printed just like I said it would, but now notice the insert line is flashing, which means I can type, and I can. If I type stuff, it allows me to. So whatever I type into here, and then I hit enter, now my code finished running. So whatever I typed into here actually will become input. That's what the point of input does. So almost like a variable, whatever I typed in here, so in this case, I typed JDKSLAKJ, that string of characters, input hello world will become that. That's what the point of input does. That's what the function of input is to do. Unlike print, which its sole purpose is just to print, input will also print, but it will then take whatever I type after my printed statement and store it in this whole value. This whole thing will be replaced with what I typed. So what that means is I can do something like this. X equals, I created a variable called X and set it equal to input hello world. And remember, input hello world will output, this whole thing will change into whatever I typed after my printed phrase, right? So if I run this again, right, hello world, and I just type back to the computer, hello, the program ends again. But now what we didn't see in the background is this time, what I typed, which is hello, is going to be stored into our variable X. The string hello, right, because strings are words, string hello is going to be stored into X. And we can use that value and do stuff with it in our code. That's what input does. It's basic, but you gotta make sure to get your head around it, because once you get that sorted and understood, it's very, very powerful. You can do a lot with it because it's user input, right? You can actually like communicate with the person using your computer. So after this, let's try to store another value, right? Say like y equals input, and let's just say, I don't know, let's ask the user for something. Let's ask, what is your name, right? So we're gonna print hello world, they're gonna type something in, and when they hit enter, it's gonna be stored into X. And then we're gonna move on to the next line here, and we're gonna ask, what is your name, right? Because that's what input does first, it prints like normal. And then whatever we type in the prompt here is gonna be replaced with all this, and that's gonna be stored into Y, in which case I'm probably gonna type a name, because the question is, what is your name? And then let's do something with that. At the very end, we'll say print, and that's actually print out whatever name I type, right? So whatever name I typed in is going to be stored into Y, but let's print that at the very end of the program after it asks these questions. So let's run. So first is our hello world line. I could type whatever I want here, like hello. It'll be stored into X. I hit enter. Now it asks the next question. What is your name? I'll type in a name, like Mark, for example. And now when I hit enter, what is expected to happen is it will move on from the next line, store whatever we typed into Y first, move on to the next line, and it will print what we stored into Y, which is what I just typed here, Mark. So it should print Mark, and then the program will end. And it did just that. So you should also practice around and mess around with input. Get very comfortable with input because it's extremely powerful, and it's what essentially is how we're going to be building the program in a couple seconds here. So this is input. It's essentially a print statement, but it records what you typed afterwards and replaces the entire function with whatever it is you typed. And with whatever it is it's replaced with, you can then store into a variable, for example, like we did here in this example. Now, once you have that down, we're going to move on to a new functionality that is very important to understand. It's one of the most powerful, arguably the most powerful thing in programming, and it is the if statement. So what does that mean? So you can actually compare two different things in programming, and if the comparison between them yields a true or false, right, a Boolean, do something. And if it's false, do something else. That is the premise of an if statement, right? So what does that mean? Let's write it out. So let's say I'm going to create a variable called x equal to input, or not even input, let's say x equals 5, the integer 5. Let's create another variable called y and set it equal to the integer 10. So we have two variables, x equals 5, y equals 10. So here's where I'm going to start writing it. If, notice how it's orange, that means it's a keyword in Python. Open close parentheses. If x is equal to y, colon, do something. So I open parentheses here after the if statement, You don't have to, but it's good practice. And essentially, whatever I type in these parentheses is a comparison. So I asked the computer, if x is equal to y, do whatever is indented after this colon here at the end of the if statement. And whatever we type in here, all this code is going to be run if and only if x is equal to y. Now notice I use two equal signs here. That is because it can be confusing for computers, right? Because the equal sign can also mean like to assign, right? So how does if I do this, the computer doesn't know if I'm asking it to compare these two, or what if it thinks I'm trying to say, oh, set x equal to y, right? Or set y equal to x. Like it doesn't know for sure. So in programming languages, often you use a double equal sign like this, and it tells the computer that this is not an assignment, so to speak. It is a comparison. We're comparing x and y. We're checking if they're equal. And if those two are equal, this whole expression, this whole parentheses will turn into the Boolean true. If they are not equal, it will turn into the Boolean false. And the point of the if statement asks if whatever's in these parentheses is true, do what's in this statement, do what's after the colon, indented here. If whatever's in here is false, skip this code. Move on to whatever's down here. Ignore. So, with that said, as we can see, right, x is not equal to 5. Sorry, x is not equal to y, because x is equal to 5 and y is equal to 10. So when it makes this comparison, it's going to see x is not equal to y. So whatever we type in here will actually not run, but let's demonstrate that. Inside this indented space here, I'm going to type print they are the same. And after the if statement, I'm going to type print program ended. So when I run this program, we're going to make a variable called x equal to 5, the integer, y equal to 10, the integer, and then we're going to compare in the if statement. If x is equal to y, print they are the same, but x is not equal to y. So this code indented here will not run. So it will ignore it and move on to the rest of the program. And the rest of the program will just print program ended. So if I run, this should just print program ended. And it does. Now what if x and y were equal? What if x is equal to 10 and y was equal to 10? Well, now x is equal to y will return true, meaning this if statement is true, and it will run whatever's indented here and proceed to move on with the rest of the program. So it will now print they are the same, and it will move on and then print program ended. So if we run, and there we go, our code executed correctly. So these are if statements. They're used to make comparisons between two different things. They're very powerful. Get comfortable. If you want, even try messing around with other data types. So say these were not integers. What if they were strings? So let's say x is equal to our name Bob, and y is equal to the name Mark from earlier, right? It's going to check if the word Bob is the same as the word Mark, right? It's going to compare the strings. If the string Bob is the same as the string Mark, obviously they're not the same, so it will execute program ended. But then, of course, if they were both named Bob, for example, and then if I run, it's going to print they are the same and program ended because the string Bob is equal to the string Bob. So this is very important. Mess around with this, do whatever you want practicing it, and experiment a bit. Try other variable types. Try for yourself even. Watch what happens if you try, for example, say two completely different data types. So try maybe a string and then an integer. Watch what happens and try to figure out why you think it happens that way. And mess around with it yourself, because at the end of the day, you learn this all by just playing with it, experimenting, trying new things, getting ideas. So with that being said, there's one more skill we need to go over before we can start actually writing a little game. And it is called string concatenation. And it's pretty straightforward, but essentially, right, let's go back to this example of, say, x is equal to the string, or let's say x is equal to input, what is your name? So it will print what is your name, and it'll ask, and whatever we type in will be stored into X. So then afterwards, right, what we would normally did in the previous example was we would just print X, right? We'd print their name back at them. So if we run what is your name, we can type in Mark, enter, and it prints back Mark. Now, what if we want to say your name is Mark, or hello Mark, for example, right? We want the computer to actually talk back and not just spit back out the name. Well, it's not as simple as just typing in the print statement hello X, right? Because the computer doesn't know what this is, right? And for it to be a string, you have to put quotation marks around it. But this still doesn't make sense, because for the computer, all it's getting from in the print statement is just a string and then a variable, but it doesn't know what to do with any of this information. So what concatenating string means is that you can actually add two strings together to make one big string. So what do I mean by that? I mean, let's say I have one string in the print statement, hello, right? And say I want to add to hello space world, right? So I want to print hello world, but let's say I didn't want to print it all in one big string. I had two different strings. I have this hello string and this space world string. To concatenate them, or that's the fancy way of just saying to mash them together, we use the plus sign, right? Like with numbers. Only instead of adding them like with numbers, it will actually just press the two strings together. And the reason we put this space here, obviously, is so that the computer knows to include that space, because without the space, it will just be hello and then immediately after world. The plus doesn't automatically, the computer doesn't automatically assume that just because there's a plus, there's a space, right? So we put that space there. So if we run this, it'll ignore the first line essentially. It'll ask what is your name, we could type whatever. It just gets stored in X. And then we print hello world. See, so I added these two strings together. Now, remember that input returns, right, after it runs and asks, it prints whatever we type in the parentheses, it will be replaced by whatever it is we typed in. And it's not just replaced by whatever it is, it's replaced by the string of whatever it is we typed in. That is how the input function works. It replaces itself with a string. It's specifically a string. So this line is setting X equal to the string of whatever it is we typed in here, in which case it was Mark when we last ran it. So using the knowledge of string concatenation, or adding the two strings together, if we want to say hello Mark, we can replace this string with the string that they typed in, their name. And we do that by just adding X. So this plus sign is here because it's adding two strings. Hello is a string because it's wrapped in quotation marks. And we can't see it in our code, but we know that once this is run, X is going to have the value of a string of whatever it is the user typed into this input statement. So this is actually going to have a string value in it. So this is essentially doing the same thing. We're adding two strings together. We're adding the string hello space and whatever it is we typed into the console. So if we run this, it's going to ask, what is your name? And let's type in again, Mark. And now the computer will spit back out, hello space, and then the string Mark. And there we go. So with all this, you can now write a program that prints to the console. You can write a program that asks the user a question, and you can spit back a response through the console that replies to said question. You can add your own little strings, your own little words to it. So with all this already, you can already essentially make a program that asks questions in response to them. But the point of the little program that we want to make by the end of this video is something that can, at the end of this video, we want to make something that can actually change its responses depending on what the user inputs into the computer, right? So say we have, this is where we're going to start actually writing it. So say we say X is equal to input, and let's ask the user, do you want to play a game? And let's specify to the user that we want them to type in Y or N. So this is going to print the string, do you want to play a game, Y/N space. And whatever the user types in, we ideally want them to type Y or N, is going to be stored into the variable X. So let's now go back to a previous thing we learned, the if statement, right? So let's say if, and this is where we're going to actually write the comparison that we want to check, right? Because we want to, depending on what the user types into the console, we want to do different things. If they type Y, which is yes, then we want to ask more questions. If they type no, then we can just end the program because the person doesn't want to play the game, and that's fine. Their choice, I guess. We can't force them. So to do that, we'll do a comparison like we did last time. We'll say if X in these parentheses is equal to, so remember we're comparing strings here, the string Y, right? Because if the user typed yes, that's what this will turn into. It'll turn into the string value of whatever they typed in, which we hope will be Y. So if X is equal to Y, meaning they typed in yes, Y, then execute whatever is in this indented space after this semicolon, right? So if X is Y, we're gonna run the whole game. Now, what if they type no? Well, then we can just have another if statement, right? If X is equal to N, do whatever in this indented space. So now we have two different conditions we check, right? If X is equal to Y, do whatever in here. If it's not, then move on to the rest of the program, which will then ask, well, if it's equal to no, or N, then do whatever's in here. And this is essentially how you ask these questions. But there's a problem with this code, that if they type N, it will ask, right, it will go through this line and it'll say if X is equal to Y, then do this. It's not going to be because they typed N, and then it'll ask if X is equal to N, then do this. But if all we want to do is end the program, we don't need to technically ask if X is equal to N. We just want it to stop. So let's introduce a new keyword here called else, right? So what else does, notice that it doesn't need any parentheses. Else asks if, right, it asks the first statement, right? If this was true, do whatever's in here. If it was not true, regardless of what else the user typed in, run whatever's beyond here, right? So if whatever they typed is not Y, run whatever goes here. And that's what an else does. And this is how we're gonna essentially write the basis of our entire program, right? So say X is equal to input, do you want to play a game Y or N? Say they type Y, then we start the game, right? We can ask another question like, okay, Y is equal to, or let's say name is equal to input, what is your name? So they'll type in, then after they've said yes, it'll ask them what is your name, and whatever they type in will be stored into name. And then we can print back hello. Name, right? Remember, we can concatenate two strings together by adding it with the plus sign, and this does return a string to name. And then we can ask another question here, like for example, Y is equal to input, are you having fun? Right? So whatever they type into here will be stored into Y. And once again, we'll make sure to specify to type in Y or N. So now, inside of this if statement, right, we can ask again if y is equal to y. That was a bit of bad naming convention. I should probably call it like z, the variable, just so it doesn't get confusing with the y for yes. But if z, right, whatever they type in is equal to yes, so if they say yes, they're having fun, then print yay, right? And then we can say else, because remember, else is going to run regardless of what else they put in. If they put in n or anything else, then we can say print I'm sorry to hear that, right? So now, regardless of what they type in here, as long if it's not y, it will not run this if statement. It'll move on to the else statement and just run this code. Print I'm sorry to hear that, right? And remember, this is all happening in this indented space. Notice how we had to indent again for these if statements and the else statements. You just have to do this for the semicolon. Anything that is indented after the semicolon belongs to this if statement, right? And the same thing applies to this if statement and the else statement and this else statement. So we actually don't need this else statement here since there's nothing here running. If they type n or anything else, essentially it'll just skip all of this and nothing will happen here. So this is our little program we have so far. So we ask, do you want to play a game, y or n? If they say yes, it's going to run all this code. If they say no or anything else, it'll just skip all this and the program will stop. If they did say yes, it'll then ask them what is your name and store it in name. It'll print out hello plus their name, and it'll then ask, are you having fun, y or n? And we ask again, we do the same comparison. If what they typed in was yes, then print yay. If it wasn't, right, else, print I'm sorry to hear that. So let's run this program finally. Do you want to play? Let's just test to make sure it works. If we type n, right, no, it doesn't run. The program ends. If I type anything else but n, right, because this only runs if and only if x is equal to y. And if I run this, also nothing happens. So now let's finally say yes. Do you want to play a game? Yes. And then it asks, it moves on to the rest of the if statement. What is your name? Let's type again, Mark. It'll say, hello, Mark. There's our print statement. And then the z input gets asked. Are you having fun? Y or n? So if z is equal to y, it'll print yay. Otherwise, it'll print I'm sorry to hear that. So let's say, yes, I'm having fun. Then it prints yay. And the program ends because we didn't write anything else after that. And that's it. That's essentially how you write your own little branching program here. Now, these questions I made pretty simple. You can make these questions whatever you want. When I was first learning programming, I would make a whole story where the computer was some sort of dungeon master, and it would ask you questions, and you'd go through the story and discover more and more about this computer, which was essentially just me writing in the background. But you can go as far and deep as you want to go. You can go if into if into if into if into if. You can nest as many ifs as you want, and the list goes on in the possibilities of how far you can go, and you can just ask question on question on question, and it can all lead to different places and branching paths, right? If they say yes to the are they having fun, you can have a whole series of questions in there. If they said no to that, you can have a whole different branching path, and you can go really crazy with this. And I think it's very important to do that, because the best way to learn programming is obviously by doing. And a lot of skills in life, the best way to learn is just by doing. So I encourage all of you to, in your own time, just come up with something funny, come up with something crazy. Maybe show your friends, or show anybody really. And just have fun with it, gamify it, play around with it. And this is pretty much the basics of programming with Python. With this, you can kind of jumpstart your whole process. And the rest of it is, just reading in your own time, learning in your own time, Googling stuff that you don't know how to do. You have to get very good at Googling if you want to be a programmer. It's a very important skill. And yeah, do that and you'll make it far. Alright, everyone. Well, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. And good luck out there. Peace out.